So, question for you. What happens when war is your norm? What happens when war is your norm? You see, as human beings, we have a really hard time coming up with peaceful situations. For pretty much the whole entire history that we know of and have documented, there has only been 268 years of peace in the world. Out of all the thousands of years, 268 years of peace. In 1945, the United Nations was formed, and they had a goal, one of those being to promote peace between nations, to bring in harmony. And they would send in people to kind of help with that endeavor. And if you read the news or you look around, you can see that somewhat the United Nations effort is a little bit fleeting. Because everywhere you look, there is conflict. Everywhere you look, there is war. But you and I both know, I think, at least I know this to be true in my life, that war is not just between nation and nation. Sometimes I think I'm living in this kind of dystopian novel, the opposite of a utopia. Because raging inside of me, and I'm sure raging inside of you at times, is a war between three entities inside of one entity, that being you. A civil war between me, myself, and I. And some of us, we know the harm of domestic war, where spouses are fighting against spouses, and it appears that they were married not by the magistrate of peace, but the secretary of war. We know that foreign policy is a little bit fleeting because we see us and we see others fighting with their coworkers and their neighbors. And if we turn on the news, then we become very much discouraged, so we turn it off, and then we open up Facebook and we start scrolling, and then we see a little bit more conflict, right? So we just turn it off, and it's really hard for us to escape the fact that as human beings, we really have a hard time coming up with peace. And to make matters worse, when we do experience those moments of peace, a lot of us, we are dreading the fact that just around the corner is something that will disrupt that peace and cause us to be in conflict again. What happens when war is your norm? What happens when you're the king of a nation and every nation around you is bringing war to your doorstep? King Saul, the first king of the nation of Israel, that was his story. That was his situation. As soon as he became the king of the nation of Israel, every nation around him was coming at him. 1 Samuel 14, verse 47 and 48 says this: When Saul assumed the kingship over Israel, he fought against all his enemies in every direction, against Moab, the Ammonites, Edom, the kings of Zobah, and the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he caused havoc. He fought bravely, defeated the Amalekites, and rescued Israel from those who plundered them. But things weren't all hunky-dory for Saul on the battlefield. It says that he was causing havoc against all the nations that were coming up against him. But if you read more of the story, we know that there is an enemy of his that would never stop. They kept coming at him and at him and at him. They were concretely set on their destruction, the Israelite destruction. And that nation was the Philistines. Every time Saul turned around, they were coming after him, and the Philistines thought that they had the perfect game plan. What happened was the Philistines got into Israelite territory, and they gathered their troops on a hill overlooking the valley of Elah. There's a picture of what that looks like today. And they gathered their troops on one hill, and King Saul and his troops countered and gathered their troops on a hill opposite of them, overlooking the valley of Elah. And they were set and poised for battle. And the Philistines felt as though they had the secret weapon, the thing that was going to cause them to be victorious and be able to enslave all the Israelites into their kingdom. But the thing is, before we get into this, it's really hard for us to understand what it was like for a warrior in the 11th century, the time that King Saul lived. It was a very violent time. Today, in modern warfare, we typically fight from a distance. We have weapons that can deal with our enemy from afar. But that was not the case for the 11th century, the ancient warriors. Many men, and sometimes even women, would be in battle against one another. And for us, we have a hard time of understanding what that was like. We know that we've seen movies, maybe like Braveheart, Gladiator, and sometimes those things help in terms of understanding what it was that they were facing. But I want to read the quote to you from Andy Stanley. He kind of set this up pretty well, I think. He said, "Even on Hollywood's best day, there's no way to take us into the world of ancient warfare because you have to smell it. You have to fear it. And it's something that most of us, fortunately, will never have to get close to." If you were a warrior in the 11th century BC, when you went to battle, you would look your enemy in the eyes. You would be able to see, because you didn't fight from hundreds of feet away, you fought at arm's length. You would see the dread in their eyes, the terror in their eyes. And if you drew the short end of the stick, you would see calm, a sure sign of a seasoned killer. Not only would you see their eyes as you are going to try and kill them and they're going to try and kill you, but you'll be able to smell the breath. You would be able to know what they ate for dinner. You would be able to smell the alcohol that they consumed in order to get rid of the anxiety of going into battle. You would have seen their eyes. You would have seen their terror, their fear. And it was only after the battle that you would be able to see, if you're still alive, if you were going to make it. It was only after the battle that you got back to camp and you wiped the blood all over you, because you surely would have been covered by blood. You would have been smelling the corpses of your dead comrades. And you would have washed that off, and if you were lucky enough to stop the bleeding of your own wound, you know that you weren't still out of the woods, because they didn't really understand germs, but they did understand infections, and they knew that a lot of times, even if you got the blood to stop, you wouldn't get the infection to stop. In fact, they didn't understand this, the germs, but they did understand it to the point where they realized that if they were wearing cloth or kind of clothes and they got punctured, they got stabbed, and that those clothes went into their wound, that they understood that that would be bad for them. And so they oftentimes fought naked with all their armor over them. And so for many of them, many men and even women, to go to battle was frightening, to say the least. Aren't you so glad that you came to church today? If you have a Bible, go ahead and open it up. I believe it's, if you grab one in front of you under the seat, it's page 247. We're going to be in 1 Samuel 17. And started in verse 3. This is what it says. The Philistines were standing on one hill, and the Israelites were standing on another hill, with a ravine between them. Then a champion named Goliath from Gath came out from the Philistine camp. He was 9 feet, 9 inches tall, and wore a bronze helmet and bronze scale armor that weighed 125 pounds. There was bronze armor on his shins, and a bronze javelin was slung between his shoulders. His spear shaft was like a weaver's beam, and the iron point of his spear weighed 15 pounds. In addition, if that wasn't enough, a shield bearer was walking in front of him. The point? This is a big dude. This is a killing machine that you, at any time in your life, you would not want to come face to face with. You would not want to see him in your region. Goes on, verse 8. He stood and shouted to the Israelite battle formations. Why do you come out to line up in battle formation? He asked them. Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose one of your men and have him come down against me. If he wins in a fight against me and kills me, we will be your servants. But if I went against him and kill him, then you will be our servants and serve us." Then the Philistine said, "I defy the ranks of Israel today. Send me a man so we can fight each other." When Saul and all Israel heard these words from the Philistine, they lost their courage and were terrified. Verse 16. Every morning and evening, for 40 days, the Philistine came forward and took his stand. There's no doubt that when this man came out, this 9 feet 9 inch giant of a man, warrior, that the Israelites would have looked to one man as their hope, as the person they thought would step up and go out and fight him. They would have looked to their king. Because what we know about King Saul is that he was a head taller than everyone else in Israel. So he was upwards of 6 feet, probably mid 6 feet. And by our standards, that's really tall, but that's nothing compared to 9 feet 9 inches, and it was nothing compared to the average Israelite man that was in his ranks. And so they started to look to their king, but after 40 days, can you imagine that? You're a warrior, a trained battlefield soldier. You've been trained to go fight, and for 40 days, this guy comes out and mocks you and taunts you and ridicules you, and you do nothing. Because the person you are expecting to do something wasn't willing to do anything. Now, what we don't see in this chapter is what I believe is going through King Saul's mind. Now, let me explain. In 1 Samuel 15, a couple chapters before we get to this point, he was in a battle with the Amalekites, and he won. God told him to destroy them, but he didn't. He took their plunder, his soldiers took the plunder, and were benefiting off of their goods that they took from him. And the prophet Samuel was told by God to go to King Saul and tell him, "Listen, you've wronged me. You hadn't listened to my word. You rejected me." And when Saul was confronted by this, he blamed his soldiers. He didn't blame himself. And so they go back and forth, and the prophet Samuel was told by God to tell him that you have rejected my word, Saul, and now I'm rejecting you as king. And we read on that the Spirit of God that was actually giving Saul the courage, the ability to go out and fight every single day and win, had left him. The Spirit of God had left King Saul. And so he was, by all accounts, not the king anymore, but he still had the office. And so you have to imagine, if you're King Saul and you've been dealing with this, the shame, the guilt, the fear of having God's favor on you completely gone. And then you see this giant of a man come before you, just challenging your whole army, and they're all looking to you. You've got to imagine that Saul was thinking one thing in his mind. That dude is my executioner. That dude was sent by God to deal with me. And so he knew he was hopeless. He knew that before the battle started. He knew he was doomed, and he knew his people were doomed because they had put their hope into him, and he knew he was hopeless. That's what misplaced hope does. It paralyzes us when we are in conflict. When we are dealing with a conflict and conflict comes and we do not have our hope in the right place, we will be paralyzed in the fetal position in a corner trying to hide. There's some interesting things that happen in the human body when we are on a battlefield. The guy named, goes by Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. He's a psychology professor and author at West Point. And this is what he says what happens inside of the human body when they're on a battlefield. He said it's called vasoconstriction. Just before the capillaries, there's a mechanical shutdown of the blood flow, and now the arteries in the body core are holding up to twice as much blood. That's why the face goes white in a battle. And what this does is it keeps the soldier alive so they can finish the fight. Because if they're shot or if they're stabbed or any kind of lesion on their body, they won't bleed out because all of the blood is on the inner core. But he says it also affects the brain, not just the body. He says as the blood drains from the face, blood drains from the forebrain, and there's no rational thought. He calls it condition black. And that condition black, the midbrain is in charge. And you'll do what you've been trained to do. No more, no less. You will do what you've been programmed to do as a soldier. No more, no less. Many of us, some of us may have been in a battlefield, but many of us will never be in a battlefield. But I wonder if what happens to the human body and the human brain when we are in a conflict such as that, if that is what happens to us, even on another level, on a spiritual level, we even know that athletes deal with this before they go into a game. It's the same stuff. What happens when you are in a conflict, and what is it that you default to? Because each one of us, depending on what's going on, depending on what our training has been, depending on where our hope is, we will default to something. What will you default to? Where does your hope go? What do the voices in your head say when you are in conflict? Does your trust go to the Lord and King of the universe, or does it go to someone or something else? Just think back to your latest trial. The thing that you have recently gone through, or maybe you're still in. What was your reaction to it? Where did your hope go? Did you condemn God? Could you see the light at the end of the tunnel, no matter what happened in that situation? What did your training or lack thereof show you? Did you look like someone who has a sure hope in training, or did you react like the Israelites did and cower in fear at what was going on in front of you? Verse 17. One day Jesse had told his son David, "Take this half bushel of roasted grain along with these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to their camp. Also take these 10 portions of cheese to the field commander, check on the well-being of your brothers, and bring a confirmation from them." So David does what David does, and he was being a good son, and he went to the battle formations early in the next morning, and he left his sheep with someone else because he was a shepherd. He was the youngest of 8 boys, and he went to go and talk with his brothers. He started asking them questions. As he's approaching the battle formation, he's hearing the battle shouts of the Israelite army, and he rushes up. He leaves the stuff that he brought with the quartermaster because he's the one handling all of that, and he gets up to the battle formation, up to the battle lines, and he finds his brothers, and he starts asking them questions. Hey, how's it going? What are you guys feeling? I need to give a report back to the dad, and I want to know what's going on. Like, what's the skinny? What's going on? And as he's talking to his brothers, he hears from afar on the Philistine side of the valley a voice shouting, and it's Goliath. And he's distracted, and so he starts listening to Goliath doing his taunts for the 40th day in a row, and then he starts noticing people around him, all around him, cowering in fear because of the man that is across the valley yelling at them. And then it hits David that he remembers something that he heard as he was making his way through the formation, that he heard that there was some other soldiers talking about the reward that they could get if anyone would actually go out and kill Goliath. It included marrying the king's daughter. It included getting land and money for his whole family. And so it hits him, and he starts asking questions. I don't know if it was because of the potential of a wife or what. He's a teenager, so you can imagine where his mind is. But he does that, and this is what happens. David spoke to the men, verse 26. David spoke to the men who were standing with him. What will be done for the man who kills that Philistine and remove this disgrace from Israel? Like, what's going to happen? I just want to hear it again. What is it? And then he says this: just who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? The troops told him about the offer, concluding, "That is what will be done for the man who kills him." David's oldest brother, Eliab, listened as he spoke to the men, and he became angry with him. "Why did you come down here?" he asked. "Why did you leave those few sheep within the wilderness? Who's with them? I know your arrogance and your evil heart. You came down to see the battle." So David's oldest brother, the leader of the siblings, is condemning David for asking these questions because in his mind, David's just there to see them humiliated. And so David responds, like kind of brushes it off, like, "Listen, big bro, I'm just trying to ask questions. I'm just here just trying to get the report for Dad. I'm just trying to see what's going on. That guy's kind of making me a little angry, so I'm just chill out, you know?" So word gets around to the Israelite camp that there's this young whippersnapper asking about this reward that Saul gave out because, he was too much of a coward to go fight Goliath, and so he gave out this reward, this potential reward for anyone who go out and kill him. And so word gets around to Saul, and he has David brought to him, and this is what he says. David said to Saul, "Don't let anyone be discouraged by that guy. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine." But Saul replied, "You can't go fight this Philistine. You're just a youth, and he's been a warrior since he was young." David answered Saul, "Your servant has been tending his father's sheep. Whenever a lion or a bear came and carried off lamb from the flock, I went after it, struck it down, and rescued the lamb from its mouth. If it reared up against me, I would grab it by its fur, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed lions and bears. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." Then David said, "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." What do you say to that? Saul said to David, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." Notice what David did. When he had a conflict right in front of him, what did he do? He recalled his past. He went back and said, "You know what? This dude's just a gnat at a barbecue bothering the armies of Israel. I've dealt with lions. I've dealt with bears. God has delivered me time and time again. And I know that my hope is not in you, King Saul." Actually, he's looking up to him. "But my hope is in the God who delivered me from the hands, the paws of the lion and the bear. I am not intimidated by him." His hope went back to what God had already done in his life. One of the worst things that we can do when we are faced with conflict in our lives is to forget what God has already been doing in our past. When we forget that, we don't have any courage to go forward. But when we remember it, we are strengthened by the fact that God will handle it, that the battle was really his. David understood that the battle was not David versus Goliath, but it was the Lord versus this little 9'9" giant of a man who, in comparison to God, was nothing. So once Saul gave him the go-ahead, he started dressing him in his armor. So this Goliath was dressed head to toe in bronze armor. So Saul did what Saul would do and started giving David all his armor. And so David's getting all this stuff on. There's a big size difference. And he's like, "Man, I can't even move in this." So he's like, "Nope, get off me." And then he grabs his shepherd's stick. And he goes down to the valley of Eli. He said, "I got this." He picks up 5 smooth stones. And archaeologists have found some of these stones that they would have used in these battles. They weighed 8 pounds. These weren't pebbles, friends. And he had a sling. Now, we typically think of a slingshot as something a kid would go out in the backyard and try and shoot a bird with. But these slings that David had, these were war machines. These were weapons. What he would do is he would put that 8-pound rock in this sling, and he would get that sling going like this. And they've kind of simulated this, and they could realize that back then they could sling an 8-pound rock 150 miles per hour. So David goes down to meet Goliath for battle, and he's got a stick, a sling, and some rocks. No sword, no javelin, no spear. That's what he's got. And he walked toward that giant with the confidence of a lion killer and a bear killer. He walked toward Goliath with the confidence of someone who is about to be used by God. And it goes on, verse 41. The Philistine came closer and closer to David with the shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he despised him because he was just a youth, healthy and handsome. I don't know if he was jealous or not, but he said to David, "Am I a dog that you come against me with sticks?" Then he cursed David by his gods. "Come here," the Philistine called to David, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts." David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with a sword, spear, and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of armies, the God of the ranks of Israel. You have defied him. Today the Lord will hand you over to me. Today I'll strike you down, remove your head, and give the corpses of the Philistine camp to the birds of the sky and the wild creatures of the earth. Then all the world will know that Israel has a God, and this whole assembly will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's. He will hand you over to us." When the Philistine started forward to attack him, David ran quickly to the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in the bag, took out a stone, slung it, and hit the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down to the ground. David defeated the Philistine with a sling and a stone. David overpowered the Philistine and killed him without having a sword. David ran and stood over him. If y'all got kids, you might want earmuffs. He grabbed the Philistine's sword, pulled it from its sheath, and used it to kill him. Then he cut off his head. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they fled. The men of Israel and Judah rallied, shouting their battle cry. They got some courage, y'all, and chased the Philistines to the entrance of the valley and to the gates of Ekron. Philistine bodies were strewn all along the Sharim road and to Gath and Ekron. That day, David did what the king of his nation wouldn't do. David fought for the Israelites. David was victorious for the Israelites. David defeated their enemy, Goliath. And David rescued them from slavery and from death. Y'all got to realize the bet that Saul was putting on when he sent David, this little shepherd boy, to battle against a 9'9" warrior of a man. If he would have lost, they would have been slaves to the Philistines. Their whole nation would have been gone. But he put his bet on the boy who had his hope in the Lord and not in him. So what happens when war is your norm? What happens when the battles are raging inside of you and all around you? What happens when the enemy is taunting you and mocking you, pointing out all your failures and all your frailties for 40 days? Where will your hope go in those moments? To whom will receive your trust? We sang a song before we came up and had the videos called "The King is Among Us." We sang these words: "We need your revival, Holy Spirit fire, burning ever brighter in our souls. Kings and kingdoms falling, hear your people calling. King of kings, we need a miracle. The King is among us and his glory surrounds us, and his fire is falling as we sing. The Savior is for us, and his love is victorious, and revival is rising in his name." I don't know about y'all, but the story of David and Goliath is very inspiring. It's very encouraging. It's very exciting to me. It's one of my favorites. But I would do a gross disservice, really insufficient job, if I just pointed you to the idea that David did it, you can do it too. You can, you will. Believe it and you will do it. Because the reality is, David and Goliath shouldn't remind us of David and Goliath. David and Goliath should remind us of the story of another king. David and Goliath should be a foreshadowing, a historical incident that should remind us of what God has done. Because all of us have a Goliath in our lives, a Goliath of our own making, a Frankenstein version. When we stack all our sin, all our guilt, all our shame, all the wrongdoings that we've had in our lives, we realize that across the valley of Elah, there is a giant trying to kill us, mocking us, taunting us, telling us that our failures and our frailties, because of those things, we have no hope. I don't know what Goliath looks like in your life, but Goliath certainly is in your life. But the hope is the fact that God, when he saw us in our despair, when he saw us in our demise, when he saw us in our fear, when he saw us cowering in fear to the things that we have created, the sin, the shame, the guilt, when he saw us hopeless and discouraged, he decided that he would come down. That he would come down and fight the battle that none of us could fight. Because what the King of Kings has done, Jesus, the King of the universe, the creator of everything, is he has come down and he has said, I will fight this battle. You see, we need not to see ourselves as David. We should see ourselves as one of the soldiers of the Israelite camp who is cowering in fear. That is who each one of us are. Because the truth is, we are not the rescuer. We are the ones needing to be rescued. We're the ones who have no courage to fight the things we've created, the enemy of ours. But what God has done is he decided that he would come down and fight the battle for us. Don't think of David and just David. He did a lot of stupid stuff, but he was willing to let God use him. We've done a lot of stupid stuff. God can use us, but we need to see that the King of Kings has come down to fight the battle against your Goliath. And he was victorious. He came down and he cut that Goliath's head off. The sin that you've had in your past, the things that still just creep up into your present, the things that you will do in your future, you need to realize that those things are fighting a losing battle because of what God has done. Because the reality is, Jesus came down, God in flesh came to rescue us from the stronghold of the enemy, Satan, sin, and death. And he came to fight for us, rescue us, and transform us. That's what David did. He fought for the Israelites. He rescued the Israelites. And he took them home. But what God has done, Jesus lived a perfect life to reign victorious over sin. Sin does not reign here on this earth. We should be encouraged by that. He gave himself on the cross in order to infiltrate the enemy of death. He used his death as the point of going behind enemy lines and defeating the enemy, because on the third day he rose from the grave. Death couldn't handle him. Death was like, yeah, I got this dude. He's done. And Jesus said, no, dude, you ain't got nothing. And not only that, but he came back and he ascended to the right hand of the throne of the Father, and he is coming back to put an ultimate end to the evil one, the liar who seeks to steal, kill, and destroy everything in his wake. He is the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, Jesus Christ, God in flesh, your hope, my hope. So if you find yourself today in need of a miracle, then you need to know that Jesus did the ultimate miracle. He took your giant of a Goliath, the one you couldn't fight, and he slayed him. He paid your debt in full, and he rescued you from the bondage you were in. And he is calling you to run to him, to surrender to him. What do you do when war is your norm? You run to Jesus. You run to the victor of the war. Because if civil war is raging inside of you, if domestic war is ravaging those around you, if you're scared and afraid of the wars that are going on around this world and in our time, then you need to run to the ultimate rescuer, the one who will not just rescue you here and now from the things that hinder you, but he will rescue you to the point where you can go to a place where there is no more war. All that is done. Because if you surrender to Christ, this is your hope, this is your promise. Revelation 21, starting in verse 1. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. I also saw this holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared like a bride adorned for her husband. Then I heard a loud voice from the throne, "Look, God's dwelling is with humanity, and he will live with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them and will be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Grief, crying, and pain will be no more, because the previous things have passed away." Then the one who seated on the throne said, "Look, I am making everything new." That includes you and me. He also said, "Write, because these words are faithful and true." Then he said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will freely give to the thirsty from the spring of the water of life." I don't know what miracle you need, but I do know what my miracle has been. 10 years ago, there was a civil war and a domestic war raging inside of me and in my family. A year later, everything hit its boiling point, just 9 years ago. I was disowned, abandoned, without hope, and more broken than I ever thought I could be. And I lived in that. It was consuming me. But then something happened. I discovered that the words that Jesus said about himself are true. That God really did create everything, that God really is in charge of everything, that God does really reign in the universe, and he loves me and you. I discovered the life-changing reality of two words: but God. You've got a Goliath in front of you. You've got a Goliath raging inside of you, telling you all kinds of lies. The reality is, God can handle that. And he wants to. 10 years ago, I was disowned, abandoned, and broken. And I'm still working that out today. It comes up in the weirdest ways. But I do know that God loves me enough that he adopted me as his son. He has given me hope everlasting. And the very fact that I am standing here before you here today is a miracle. My name is Brandon Kelley. And that, my friends, is my miracle. So I don't know what miracle you need today. I don't know if your miracle is like mine, that you've experienced that. If you haven't, then I need you to know that the time is now. The time can be right now. After service, there are going to be people in the front corners of this room who would love to talk with you about what it looks like to surrender to Jesus, to surrender to the King of Kings and pledge your allegiance to him. And here in a little bit, Jay Phillips, our worship pastor, is going to be able to baptize his son Jonah, so the baptistry is already warm. So if you need to have that miracle happen to you, that ultimate miracle, then I encourage you to come up and have a conversation with one of the individuals who will be up here after the service. And if you are here and you know what I'm talking about because you've experienced it for yourself, I just want to encourage you to thank God for it. Thank him for what he has done in your life. And don't miss next week, because we're going to continue in our series, Do It Again, and see the miracles that God has done in the past and ask him to do it again today. So would you guys stand? We're going to pray and sing a song, and then we'll continue in our time together. Let's pray. God, you are good.